problems have you witnessed arising from COVID-19, and how can these be addressed? Christophe, I'm sorry, you're muted.
Thank you, Meda. Very nice to see you on screen. Good morning, everyone. Good to see so many of you joining. And it's a great initiative by UNDP Bangkok and Government Insider partnering. And I'm very happy to be joining Titon for this dialogue. So problems. I mean, I could take the traditional cut and talk about health and socioeconomic problem, but you know, when reflecting on what happened in Indonesia, I mean, the first problem has been the brutality of the disruption. It has cut off everything, including, you know, in a state that's in an archipelago, just like the Philippines, including transport, production, distribution chain. So that's one. I think second big problem is the dimensions. Indonesia, just like the Philippines, is very used to have disruption problems caused by natural disaster, whether it's earthquake, volcano eruption, or tsunami. But this one was different. It was also very different from the financial crisis that Indonesia had in the past. It basically touched on everything, all parts of the economy, the society, collective, individual. So this multi-dimension is a big problem. And third problem is it's a problem of choice. And it would be very interesting, Titon, to hear you know, how you've seen it in the Philippines. But for Indonesia, the problem has been, how do you choose between, you know, health, protection, and keeping the economy going? And that has been a very difficult choice, and I don't think we've come to term in Indonesia about that choice. So that's, you know, a first problem. And the second problem, which is looming and which is why I'm very happy to see Indonesia so active, is next-gen governance, is a choice between a recovery that will be about economic growth only, which could be ground recovery, or a different recovery, one that is green, that is based on transformation. So that's where the problem becomes hopefully a solution and becomes an aspiration. So if you take that cut a little bit more in the spirit of NextGenGov, this is how I would see it in Indonesia. And I think it would be very interesting to see the similarities, but also the differences with our neighbors in the Philippines. So, Meadow, I'll stop here for this first one.
Sure, Titon, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, thank you, and good morning to everyone. Good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you are in this globe. And nice to see you as well as our panel facilitator, and good to see you, Christophe. Look, I think the really interesting question here is, how big is the problem? As Christophe said, I think both Indonesia and the Philippines have, interestingly, let's see if this is the case, but I think they have the three major dimensions, which is the health dimension, the economic dimension, and I would suspect in Indonesia they also have a security dimension like we have here. On health, and the reason why I say how big is the problem is that the biggest challenge is to get a good handle on the extent of that, and we know to get a good handle, a couple of things have to be in place. One is that we really need to understand what is the contact tracing capabilities in the country. The numbers in the Philippines is really interesting. We have 30,000 confirmed cases, about 1,000 deaths. But if we look at both in terms of the applicability of contact tracing, it's very embryonic. Very few people are registered on the application, which allows you to see what the potential risk of infection is. But more interestingly than that is just the testing. And at the moment, the national capability of testing is only 30,000 per day. Now, when you have a population of 100 million and you're testing 30,000 a day, if you get to 30,000, you really still are not getting a good handle on the situation. So for me, I don't know whether the current rate of confirmed cases is in fact an accurate rate. On the economic side, I think what's really quite interesting here in the Philippines is that this is a predominantly urban problem, right? So the infections have not spread evenly across the country. It is by far concentrated in Metro Manila and a large another large urban setting, which is Cebu. And I think that that's really interesting because of the fact that in the Philippines economic context, the bulk of the economy, the driver of the economy is Metro Manila and Luzon, which is the large island the Metro Manila is situated in. Because it's affecting the urban setting, it's having a major impact on the economy. And what we're seeing is really, I think, a tragedy that's unfolding. The Philippines has worked very hard to bring down its poverty rate over many, many years. And I think just before COVID started, we were declaring success or significant progress where poverty had fallen to 16% and a little bit above of the population. But likely now we're going to see 6 million new poor, which really underlines the fragility of poverty reduction in the Philippines. So a large number of people sit just above the poverty line, and a shock like this drops them right back below the poverty line. What we don't know, of course, is how quickly they will be able to get back on the right side of the poverty line, because we don't know whether this is going to be a V-shaped recovery. We don't know if it's going to be a W-shaped recovery, and we don't know if it's going to be a U-shaped recovery. So, and that's what I mean, how big is the problem? How long is the problem? Where is it affecting? The final point I just want to draw out here is on the security side, because I think globally we focus very much on the health dimension and the economic dimension. But there's a really interesting dynamic here in the South, which has a large Muslim population and has for a long time been seeking autonomy from the government and has been granted that. We're seeing the rise of violent extremism and adherence to the ideology of extremism, whatever that may be. And COVID is actually providing an impetus for this move for young people to join the ranks of extremists, primarily for two reasons. One is a bit of an ideological narrative, which really says that this is God's punishment, and if you follow heathen practices, then clearly you will be affected. So join the ranks, and it's quite a compelling narrative. The other one is the obvious one, that in the absence of economic benefits flowing to a group of people who for many, many years, decades, tried to seek initially independence and now autonomy, they want to see the peace dividend. So if that's not delivered quickly, COVID actually acts as a bit of an imperative to join the ranks of extremism. So some interesting dimensions. But Christophe, I just wonder in Indonesia, where you're also seeing this rather interesting dimension of COVID in terms of potential security risks.
Not so much, actually. I mean, that, there have been security concerns about some of the disruption that can be caused, but not this junction yet with the phenomenon that you're describing. So, I mean, in that sense,
oh, I think we've perhaps Christophe's connection is recovering, but perhaps in the meantime, Titon, we can talk a little bit about, have there been any emerging responses that have surprised you and that have been particularly promising in the Philippines?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, and I think I'm not sure if the word has surprised me, because in the Philippines, the role of the private sector has always been large. In a conventional sense, they drive the economy, but because Philippines is one of the most disaster-prone countries in the world, there's been a long history of the private sector stepping up to play a role in terms of response to crises. And they've certainly done that in a very, very big way here in the Philippines. And in a predictable sense, there's a corporate social responsibility that the private sector adopted. In fact, they mobilized nearly $100 million in relief assistance for the poor that have been affected by COVID. They're trying to fill some of the gaps in the health system by setting up testing facilities, and I think 20% of the facilities now will be provided by the private sector. They're providing the health support in terms of more hospital beds, But what's really interesting is that we're seeing some real interesting innovations here. Just recently, there's been the issuance of the first ever COVID response bond, which was issued by a private bank here. And the aim of that is to recapitalize SMEs. SMEs here in the Philippines account for something like 60% of business revenues. They account for 35% of GDP and 63% of the labor force. So they are the bulwark of the economy. But micro and small businesses only constitute about 1% of bank borrowings. So here we're seeing the private sector step in, issue a bond with the intention of now to increase the portfolio share of small and medium size enterprises. And it's a real need here because there's something like $1 billion in loans that have been provided to micro and small enterprises. And over 50% of that is now in jeopardy because we know that at least 50% of micro and small businesses have now closed down. So this is an incredibly important contribution. And I think it's one of those innovations. And surprisingly, when government is now really hard pressed because it has a pretty huge debt to GDP ratio to deal with. The fiscal space is shrinking as it mounts its amelioration programs. So there has to be a whole of society approach in terms of the response, and the private sector stepping up in this sort of innovative way is just one example of them filling a fairly significant gap in terms of the response. Have we got Christophe back, or is this going to be just me at this time? He's back, that's good.
Oh, I think so.
He's connecting.
Hello, Christophe, welcome back. Can you hear us?
He's on mute still. Christophe, you're on mute.
Okay. Sorry, I didn't really mean to leave you alone, Titon, abruptly. Connection is very bad today, and I'm now on roaming, and it took a little bit of time to ship. So joining back, but I'm sure you were giving it all information we need to hear.
Christophe, we were just discussing whether we've seen any emerging responses in your countries that have particularly surprised you or that have been promising. So Titon talked about how the private sector in Philippines has played a huge role, and I was wondering what your perspective was on that.
Yeah, no, we've seen surprising things in Indonesia. I mean, the fact that the government kept working and shifted to this digital way of working has been a very pleasant surprise, because I don't think it could have been taken for granted, especially in some of the outside Jakarta area. It may be a little bit more difficult, but that has been an important dimension. The good thing has also been the innovation. I mean, Indonesia is an innovation-prone scene, but we've seen quite a number of interesting development, innovation-based, technology-based, in West Java, with an application that has received quite good media coverage, and I'm sure government side may have looked into it. Picobar, so that has actually been a good thing to see. From the private sector, it has been. I mean, they have been active in terms of communication, webinars, talking about the various issues. We hope that they can become much more active into shaping the new normal. And that's something that UNDP, together with WHO, is engaging with a number of business association companies. What does a new normal mean, and how do we build a new normal in Indonesia that is both health aware and at the same time allows for some resumption of economic activities? This is just starting, and it's also something we can compare now with the Philippines, because private sector obviously in Indonesia will be a major player. You won't have a new normal, you won't have the kind of recovery we want unless we have the private sector. So definitely one of our partners in Indonesia.
Fantastic. And I just want to over here encourage our audience to send in your questions as well, and we'll be incorporating that into the conversation too. I just wanted to look at, Titon, you talked about the impact that this is having on poverty in the country. How can we ensure that the most vulnerable don't suffer the most in the midst of these crises?
Mitra, before I come back to that, can I just pick up on one point that that Christophe made, which I think is a really interesting point. Sorry, I'm not sticking to script by answering your questions. My apologies on that. But he, you know, he talked about this, what I'd call the grand trade-off, right, between do you lock down everything, or do you, in order to contain the rate of infections, or do you open up the economy? And as I mentioned, that you know, this has really hurt people a lot. So, and you hear it across the globe. You know, people say that, you know, I'm not worried about dying from COVID, but I am worried about dying from hunger and a lack of income. So it's a very, very important question. And here in the Philippines, we're toying with the idea. It's not matured yet, but whether we can help the government try to understand whether there is an option other than a really strict and severe lockdown, or completely opening up the economy. So both, I mean, the first obviously helps you in terms of your rate of infections. The second helps you in terms of your economy, but both have very strong negative effects. So is there a halfway house? And again, here I'd like to see whether, you know, in Indonesia, they're thinking the same way. So there, you know, there's a couple of interesting models that are being done, modeling that's being done globally, and we want to see whether this can be applied. One approach is that, you know, you can have a 50-day strict lockdown followed by 30 days of opening. So it gives people some opportunity for continuing their businesses, but also allows you to quickly manage the rate of infection. So it's a classic hammer and dance. Another one I think that's come out of Israel is 2-week cycles of, you know, 4-day work weeks followed by 10-day voluntary quarantine. And obviously that 10 days allows you to see if you're infected, and then you can seek medical help, but it gives you 2 weeks of engagement in the economy. And a third model obviously is to concentrate the restrictions based on demographics. So if you're older and you're more vulnerable, limit your exposure there, or by geography, as in the Philippines, because we're not seeing an even spread across the country. Can you, if you've got good data and you know where the hotspots are, can you contain those areas, limit movement, but then relax when the numbers are better. So there's some really interesting opportunities to model this and look at it in terms of its impact in various parts of the economy, and see which model works. Because I think it's a really critical point that we don't get into this trade-off between one or the other. But again, I don't know if Christophe is thinking, or Indonesia's done something similar.
But you want me to answer that one, or shift to the vulnerable?
Christophe, sorry, I think there's a bit of an echo from, I think we've got 2 of you on the call, and there's a bit of an echo because of that. There we go, yeah, that should be good. Could you just say that again?
Quickly on the trade-off, because I see also Vishwa as a question. I mean, there are, 2 different types of trade-off, right? The one is between health and economy, and that the immediate trade-off. What we've seen in Indonesia is a mix. Unlike a number of countries that have really opted for, you know, a lockdown and the freeze of the economy to control the pandemic and then resume, Indonesia has done something in between. So on one hand, it has, you know, allowed the economy to keep going and probably minimize the disruption. At the same time, it's probably going to extend the pandemic. So it means for us, whatever we think of this choice, it means for us that we're also looking, you know, in the case of Indonesia, had a pandemic that can go on for a number of months at best. And you see an increasing amount of media coverage on this. And that's actually extremely complex to handle. As a second trade-off is the one Titon is mentioning as well, and that's a brown versus green to simplify it. And in Indonesia, I think it's going to be a trade-off between the easy solution, vested interest, immediate growth resumption, or a little bit of a more visionary, longer-term approach. So it may be that you need to sacrifice a little bit of your immediate energy activity. It may be that you have to sacrifice a little bit of your digits in terms of growth, but to go for something that is actually much cleaner, much greener, and much more sustainable. And it's a complex trade-off because you have different perspectives. It's not only the long term and the short term, it's also different angles, vested interest I mentioned. So, and we will come to it. It's also a matter of not only economic rationale, but political will. I'd like to comment on your question on the vulnerable. I mean, I don't think you can ensure that the vulnerable are not the one who suffer too. I mean, we just have to admit they're going to be the one that are going to be the most affected. I think our question is how can we limit the suffering, cushion the impact, and then how can we build in the longer term work that we're doing systemic change that will protect those more vulnerable in the future, in the case of another crisis. So again, it's a combination of first knowing who the more vulnerable are, and I don't think it's actually an easy answer because you see, and we've done a little bit of work in Indonesia, it goes beyond the traditional groups of population that you think about. If you look at, people were doing well, so they were not even just above the poverty line, but they were actually quite progressed. I mean, they were aspiring middle class, and now all this is green. So we're talking about significant numbers, but also different populations. Young entrepreneurs, we're talking a lot with young entrepreneurs as UNDP Indonesia. They were not classified last year as the most vulnerable, but now they are, because their economic activities, the startups, everything is being, threatened, if not totally stopped. And then their personal situation and the families actually also become vulnerable. So that's, one dimension. We have to know who they are. We have to engage with them. I think we're not only talking about just handing out support. There may be, cash transfers and other things, but engaging with them to actually better understand. That's why we're spending so much time talking to households and young entrepreneurs and those, population, also women entrepreneurs, particularly important. And then we have to work with a little bit of imagination of about the future. And if we talk about safety net, social protection, that's where also NextGenGov is very important, because we need to, together with the government, think about different systems, much more ambitious, radical changes. So we're not only talking about a marginal expansion or a temporary expansion. I think it would be great if we can encourage government, but also national partners to think about different ways of protecting those most vulnerable you were mentioning, Meda. So we build actually a future that is safer for them and for the whole society. So we don't have to go back again if another crisis happens. We don't have to go back with emergency package, but we have something that is actually more thought through, learning from the experience of this very crisis. And that, I think in UNDP Indonesia, that's what we try to do together with a few other agencies.
Fantastic. And we've talked a lot about sustainable growth. We've talked about ensuring that perhaps there should be a new way of growing after this. What could that sustainable recovery look like in the future? And you talked about the need for radical changes. What are some of the first steps that both of you would recommend?
Can I just a couple of points here is that I think the tendency to go for radical changes is the right tendency. It's the right instinct, because we need transformation. So I don't have any issue with that, and we can talk a little bit about the transformative agenda. But I think what something like COVID does is really exposes the weaknesses in the foundation. So when we talk about vulnerability, we have to be careful that we don't sort of move to the exciting end of town, which is important, without looking at the foundations. And I think for me, you know, the foundations are really quite problematic here. So in the Philippines, for example, if you think about it, you know, 7 out of 10 people are unbanked. So they're not in the formal banking system. So you can imagine that. So anytime you have a shock, the level of savings is quite minimal. So you become incredibly exposed. So this is a fundamental that has to be addressed. So without even talking about transformations, we need to talk about, you know, how do you bank the poor? If you look at insurance, and I'm sure it's the same in Indonesia, is that there are very, very few people who have any form of insurance, whether it's micro insurance or even life insurance. And in fact, I think in the Philippines it's about 38%, but that captures a fair bit of the middle class who have the insurance products. So, you know, how do you look at new strategies to make sure people are insured and that insurance is inclusive in its nature? Access to finance. You know, we know that in Indonesia it's the same as in the Philippines. The economy is driven partly by the informal sector. But how does the informal sector access finance? And you know, we don't have an extensive reach of microfinance here in the Philippines. So the other issue is inclusive value chains. So far, you know, at the moment, if you want to talk a little bit about resilience, you know, how do you bring the poor into resilient value chains? How can they be linked to the big conglomerates which drive the top end of the economy, but the poor feed into it? So these are more foundational issues that I think we haven't really, we should be careful that we don't lose sight of. The other point I want to make, and just to echo Christophe's point, is that we really need to understand better the nature of the impact, and where one of the most transformative opportunities is really how do you facilitate evidence-based policy and programming. And for me, one of the biggest drivers of this, or enablers of this, is to use data in a very comprehensive way. We've heard about the data revolution, but the COVID really needs all of us to sort of accelerate that revolution. We can't rely on census data, which is often, you know, 5 years between drinks. Administrative data is incredibly problematic and is often analog, so we need to digitalize that. We have an incredible source of information, which I suppose some people call dark data, but is really big data, right? Data which is held by the private sector primarily. So how can you bring in philanthropic data collaborations, which gives us access to this rich source of information and then helps us define policy and programs? And then, you know, social media, what an amazing forum for information as we try to understand sentiments. Social media scraping should be, you know, a standard part of policy formulation and programming, and there are plenty of tools that enable us to do that. So as I say, I think for me, get the foundations right, look at some of the transformative opportunities that Christophe has highlighted in terms of brown and green, but if you don't have a solid base, it's going to be very hard to move into some of these transformative opportunities. So it's not an either-or proposition, but it's a parallel proposition.
Now, what you're saying is very true, Titon. And actually, it's not like, you know, all of a sudden we woke up and we found about lack of financial inclusion. I mean, all those issues were known before. I think what the COVID-19 has done, they've been laid bare. I mean, they've become even more, you know, apparent, even, you know, we've understood better what the implications are. So it's not just in one unfortunate way, probably, you know, be a validation of all the things we've been talking about, like financial inclusion, like of, you know, of banking, banking inclusion, all this. It also offers an opportunity for acceleration. So we need to use that, all the good things that we've been talking about financial inclusion, now needs to be accelerated and needs to cover, a larger share of the population. And I think also we need to, leverage on some of the experience. So it's acceleration, but it's also try to, when we talk about transformation, it's not like, okay, all of a sudden we're coming with something that is radically different, but it's also the way it's going to be used. So your example is good. I mean, social media, yes, they should be part of the dialogue, and they should also be the voice of the citizens, should be part of the shaping of this new agenda we're talking about, should be part of the transformational changes. So in Indonesia, we have this, citizen feedback mechanism, Lapor, and we've been using it for COVID-19 related issues. We need to find ways to actually have the voice of citizens fully included in the debate about making those transformation, about shaping the new future. Now, in some other countries, you've seen that. It's a national dialogue, it's other forms. I think we need a little bit of that in Indonesia, maybe in a more structured way. Indonesia is probably the country where we have, the largest percentage in terms of social media and activity, but we need to actually make that link between the social media, very dynamic scene, and the policy that are being shaped, which boils down to this, citizen contract with citizen, with the way governance work in the future. This next gen governance is not about government only. It's about the citizens and the voice they have, whether it's in social media or through other channel that maybe needs to be invented. But that's also the exciting part of it, if you look at it from an optimistic point of view.
Absolutely. And we've got a question actually from Caitlin, who is UNDP's resident representative in Vietnam. And she said that on testing, it's not necessarily that quantity that matters, but it's intensive contact tracing combined with rapid testing and quarantines of high-risk people. Early management and quarantines are also key. And she says, Vietnam provides a strong model in this context. What opportunities would there be to share Vietnam's experience with both Philippines and Indonesia? Titon, do you want to go first?
No, I think we'd certainly welcome Vietnam as an incredibly successful case, right? So we've seen the country very effectively manage the rate of infections, and we're not seeing further outbreaks. And I think, as Caitlin's indicating, there's a formula there that has to be applied. One issue for me is really on contact tracing, and it really raises a very interesting dimension, which is data privacy and the risks of using data for other purposes. And I think, in the Philippines, we're in an interesting period. I think there's obviously a desire to deal with the current issue, but there is also a latent fear about how information and platforms that may be put in place to deal with COVID may not be used in appropriate ways in the future. And I think they're legitimate citizens' concerns, and it's not a criticism of the current administration, but I think we're seeing it in every country where there's so much access to data which allows effective contact tracing. So I'd be really interested in how, not only from the Vietnam experience, but in experiences in other countries, how this issue of data privacy and only using information for a particular purpose is somehow guaranteed to give citizens trust. I mean, which is at the moment is remarkable. If you look at it globally, the amount of trust in governments has gone up exponentially because people realize they're very dependent on government. The private sector is incredibly dependent on government now. But we want to build on that and we don't want to dilute it. And I think issues about how you handle data raises some interesting questions. So I'd be fascinated to hear from not only Christophe and Caitlin, but others in terms of how they're dealing with that issue.
Yeah, very much so. Same for me, Titon. I mean, it's great to have a Indonesia-Philippine dialogue, but it goes beyond all two countries. And if you look at for me, NextGenGov, what is it? I mean, first it's it's about what UNDP believes in and advocates for. That's the first dimension, that's the UNDP dimension. It's about the work that we're doing in Indonesia, in the Philippines, but it's also about this exchange among, our countries. And I'd like to link Caitlin's question with the one that Renaud's asked about centralization, decentralization. I mean, it's actually amazing the amount of issues, but also solutions that are emerging from this crisis. And we all look at Vietnam and the way it is actually the numbers. I look at the Vietnam numbers every day, and then I compare them with Indonesia. So there is a lot to be learned from the crisis control prevention, but also in other areas like data, which you just mentioned. I think in the Philippines, Titon, you've done a lot of work on data. Data is a massive issue in Indonesia. I don't think we've come to grips. So you could actually very well identify, and that's the next gen governance chapeau. You could have very, very well defined areas where peer-to-peers and exchange among country would be of great value. And it's not only at the national level, and that's where I come to Renaud's question. You also see in all countries, and Indonesia is on the opposite side as Thailand. We are an extremely decentralized structure. You see a lot of differences, a lot of a great degree of variety in experience in the way local governments responded, and into the interaction between central and local government, and sometimes quite complex. And I think if you look at a governance point of view, this interaction between central and local government in a pandemic context yields a lot of response. Last point on this, I think it will also be one of the values of NextGenGov to try to capture what local government have done. And that's what, in Indonesia, we have a special partnership with West Java, which is, heavily affected, but where you see a lot of innovation springing up. So this local government dimension is very much part of the exchange among countries that we want to facilitate. And again, there is a lot of very interesting case studies that would be useful, not from an academic point of view, but from a very practical governance dimension, the one that we want to work on with NextGenGov.
Christophe,
sorry, go ahead.
Pick up on this notion of decentralization. I think is fascinating, because there is a governance decentralization between national and subnational. I think that's what you were referring to. But I think decentralization to me is a much broader term, and rather than calling it decentralization, I look at it as distributed responsibility. So it can be vertical in nature between a national government and a local government, but it can be horizontal in nature. And I think this is a really exciting part of COVID, and I think this is what part of the next gen governance agenda is about, is how do we facilitate this incredible amount of innovation that comes not in a centralized way, but in an incredibly decentralized way. And the market model, I suppose that and it's one of the agenda items, is about lead markets. One segment of the private sector develops a particular product, and then there's a lagging market which catches up. But it's a very iterative model. But where the potential in COVID is that you can really distribute that creativity and innovation. And I think that this is really what we should be looking at, is how do we move away by this notion of many people pursuing solutions, but only a few perfecting them, to many people pursuing the solutions, but many perfecting those solutions and creating the knowledge platforms. And if I had to sort of describe one major achievement that next generation governance could actually aspire to, is to create that distributed learning platform. And if we can gather policymakers, program people from the region, and really try to understand, for the various problems that we've discussed here today, what some of these solutions are. So we don't have to keep reinventing the wheel. And this is about accelerated impact, because we have to cut the cycle of iterative design, coming up with unique solutions, but rather have a rapid transmission process. So that's my take on decentralization, which is a much more horizontal notion of decentralization.
Yeah, same in Indonesia. I think, no, you're very right. I mean, it goes beyond the traditional devolution, and it goes beyond the vertical level. And if we look at learning, to pick up your example, yes, I mean, let's not have a misconception that innovation will be, originate from government or will be government driven. It's actually not the case. If you look at learning, a lot of entrepreneurs or even individuals have come up with very interesting things. So how do you capture that, and how do you make it part of the this horizontal governance? I think that's an interesting concept that you put forward, Titon, and one that Alex and the team could work on, and as part of NextGenGov.
So we've actually got a lot of ideas going around how what NextGenGov could look like. Could you talk a little bit about the role that UNDP plays in this, and how it's encouraging this, and how it's building partnerships to enable this, particularly with the labs and the new networks that you're building in the region?
I mean, let me say first, I mean, it's great that UNDP is taking up this, this idea of NextGen. So just putting it there, I think is really something that is worth doing. And as UNDP, both at the regional level and at the country level, we are very much engaged. And I'm very happy to see the response of, Indonesian partner that we have approached. So just, setting the context is very important in terms of what UNDP can do. But it has to go beyond that. I think, we're doing quite a number of things in our countries. And again, it's not only Indonesia. So we need actually to make sure that we harness it, that we make sure it's not limited to one country or one area in the country or one partner, but that we actually able to, to generate a real exchange and have this internalized in the national response. And again, we go beyond the government, because the point is not only to speak about it, it's not only about exchanging about it, it's also about making it happen. And that will actually require, our work and the NextGen governance to go down to very concrete examples, to actually look at things that have worked and make sure that actually they're expanded, that they become part of the governance. So it's a whole program of work that we're talking about. So it goes beyond the summit very clearly. But I think if we're able as UNDP to really make it part of our, governance remain core to our mandate. It's really one core of the activity. But if we're able to actually find a ways to actually make it happen and create a dynamic that goes, that is both a local, a national, and regional dynamic. I think that would be great. So that's, I think, what will be driving us in Indonesia, and I guess other countries looking at some of the response from fellow res reps.
Titon, was there anything you want to add on that?
I think for me, there's an interesting thing here that governments are now incredibly challenged to work at scale and speed, and government decision making doesn't necessarily lend itself to that dynamic, but they're being forced to, and we're seeing some incredible policy and programmatic innovations around the globe. So I think when you look at where UNDP can support, I think it's the ability to provide real-time sandboxes for government. That while they're preoccupied and correctly so by mounting an effective response, thinking about recovery, they don't often have the bandwidth to rapidly trial certain approaches. So if UNDP is able to do that, and we've certainly, as an example, in terms of digital payments, mobile wallets, this hasn't been a feature of the way amelioration payments are made to the poorest of the poor. And we're working in a very accelerated, concentrated way to see how can you do this? How can you make that payment to the poorest of the poor? How do you change the behavior of the poor so they adopt, digital transactions? And if we can show what the lessons are and translate that into a playbook for government, which can be rapidly rolled out into transformation of their payment system. I think that's one really significant way, and there are many different examples. That's just one. The other one I think is really looking at strengthening government capabilities in anticipatory governance and foresight, because what I think COVID is showing us very clearly is that this notion of a VUCA world, vulnerable, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous, it's really there, right? We're feeling it in a very tangible way at the moment. And again, if we think about the way government works, it's not necessarily tuned to be able to look at that dynamic change very, very quickly. So how can we transmit some of the methodologies that are available, and even some of the practices where governments are working more effectively in anticipating the future, and make sure this becomes part of policy making and programming in government. And the final thing I just want to say is, I think data is the answer, right? We cannot have any policy and program that's divorced from evidence. So UNDP really needs to help governments strengthen the data architecture, because that's the only way we'll know what needs to be done and is it working when we make the right choices.
It's nice you're using the word anticipatory governance, Titon. Actually, I was listening to you. I was recalling sometime last year, and Caitlin is listening. We were, UNDP Indonesia. We contacted UNDP Vietnam because they were working on anticipatory governance. It was already labeled that way, and we found it interesting. There's so much interesting now. I mean, that's really, it has, again, it's a validation thing. And we can make it really part of our work with government for all the very good reasons you've given. The need for real-time, for reactivity, for database, anticipatory governance. Yes, I think you have clear connection, and the fact that some countries like Vietnam and UNDP Vietnam were working on that actually also give us a very strong basis at the regional level.
Fantastic. I believe Caitlin is just reflecting on what we've been discussing. She says the issue of data privacy is huge, much bigger than COVID. However, not using data when it can be life-saving is not the answer. Rapidly addressing the health issue enables the government to rapidly open up the economy. Key to the discussion is what governance models make a difference during crises. Anticipatory and agile governance are key, and I think this really ties in with what we've been discussing as well. We had a question from Renaud Maya, who is the UNDP representative of Thailand. Actually goes back to the issue we were talking about around decentralization. And he says, in Thailand, a very centralized country, the response was partly decentralized, with provincial governors empowered to decide COVID measures at subnational levels. This was partly balanced with nationwide measures justified by central government as a way to foster efficiency. He's wondering if there are any lessons from other countries on this.
Mitra, I think that one I answer when I link my response to Caitlin and Renaud. So the answer is yes, definitely. And it's both a central local nexus and then some local government response, whether it's provincial or district. But again, we have very different systems, but it's good to have an exchange that capture the local level. Quickly on data privacy, yes. I mean, it's Titon explained it very well. It's about data, having government using data, having reliable, comprehensive data, etc., which is a challenge in Indonesia. Data privacy is a huge one. We had actually included that in the very first response that we drafted as one consideration. And I have to say, working with Pulse Lab Jakarta, and at one point we actually, we stopped a possible cooperation on data because we felt there was a privacy risk. So yes, it's definitely something that we need to take into consideration. It's part of our governance. It's part of citizens' rights. So data privacy, and I can tell you, I mean, from that very example that we decided not to go for, it is complex, but it's actually definitely part of the response and the consideration that we need to give, probably even more than before.
We've got a question from Bishwa Tiwari. They say several of the countries in the region are marred with governance challenges. How does NextGenGov plan to improve governance apart from vertical devolution and horizontal coordination? or improving local level data, as you mentioned earlier?
Titon, you want to go?
Okay. I'm not sure how NextGenGov does it, but I think in terms of governance, one of the biggest issues is ready access to information, right? So as I was mentioning that there is this unprecedented time, I think, in global experience where we've gone from this period when there was such little trust in government to an incredible rise in trust of government. And I think, as I mentioned, that's because of the dependency we have in government responses. So when we think about governance, for me, one of the big issues is access to information, creating of spaces for constructive criticism in terms of what's working and what's not working. Because often my worry is when we focus on governance, we often focus on the technical issues of governance, testing, tracing, etc., economic responses, whether it's national or decentralized, but creating that space and the trust in terms of the information, so it's transparent. So as a society as a whole, we understand risk and we understand opportunity, and creating that space for contributions by all to the future directions. I think that's the sort of next gen governance conversation we really should have. It's a little bit of the old, but it's in a new bottle, I think, which is that we are now really faced with this incredibly volatile context, and we need perspectives which aren't limited in very vertical ways of creating those perspectives. So when we think about governance, how do we create that space for the broader set of inputs, the openness to criticism about what's working and not working, and if we can crack that, I think we start to then see real sustainable solutions.
Just on that, I mean, we have to pitch it and understand it at the right level. I was reading on Friday, the new package put together by the European Union is called NextGenEU. I think it's a very good way to give credit to UNDP and use our label, but it's also a very good way to illustrate the comprehensiveness of what we are talking about when we talk about next gen, including next gen governance. It's not only about vertical devolution, it's not only about horizontal coordination, and it's not about tools, even data. I mean, it's those are part of the picture, but it's when we talk about next gen governance, it's really about a vision. It's ultimately about, shifting governance, if not transforming it totally, but shifting governance to have actually a different way of operating, a different way of interacting with citizens, and a different, approach to the future. I mean, to the development future, to the development path. That's really what it is about, and all this flow from it. So for me, NextGenGov is about a vision. It's about a number of fundamental changes that we need to make, because that crisis actually vindicated them. We were advocating for them before, but the crisis has vindicated them, and then brings a whole governance dimension and all governance actors around it. And that's where UNDP role is interesting, because it's actually it's this whole of thoughtful, cutting edge thinking that we try to promote, and we have a great opportunity to do so. It's also about this convening role. It's about, substance as well, and it's about doing it. The whole work we're doing, working very concretely on innovation, now is a time actually to leverage it. So those are the different dimension. But I think next gen governance is we should not have a reductionist understanding of it. It's actually quite large, it's quite ambitious, but that's actually the way it should be. That's how I see it from Indonesia.
Yeah, Christophe, it's a really good point. I mean, I think you boiled it down really well and sort of talking about vision. But my question to you would be, and to everyone listening, is whose vision, right? And I think one of the questions we were going to sort of explore was the role of young people. So if you look at the context of the Philippines, there is a huge youth bulge, right? So the future belongs not to us, but it's really to young people. So when we talk about social contracts, we talk about visions, we really need to be talking about how we create space for young people to express and articulate that the future they want and also the future that they need. And they're two slightly different propositions. And I think, again, when we talk about UNDP, our business model has always been of working primarily with government, helping on policy and programs and the like. But we really have to accelerate and really underline the voice of young people, give them the tools to be able to envision the future and then articulate it. And that should become a very strong push for the way government and in fact even the private sector responds.
Yeah, same in Indonesia, Titon. And actually, recalling what you were mentioning at the very beginning of this conversation on on the prevention of violence extremism. Now, in Indonesia, and I guess the same for you, we saw, the young people, the millennials, becoming very vocal and very active about, prevention of violent extremism, tolerances, and we actually worked a lot. Now, we need to see the same level of, voice of engagement on those whole issue of, shaping the future. We haven't seen it. Honestly, I see still a lot of actions by the millennial movement still on the prevention of violence extremism, and we need that. We need to keep it and should not drop the ball, far from it. But we need also to have the same level of activities from the young people in this whole discussion. And how can UNDP, facilitate that? I think is also part of the role that we need to explore. But fully agree with the way you describe it for the Philippines. Same in Indonesia, clearly.
And on that note, I think we do need to wrap up. We've hit the hour. We've still got a lot more questions coming in, so I'm sure this conversation will continue. Thank you so much, Titon and Christophe, for joining us today and taking the time to talk with us. And thank you to the audience for joining in as well and all of your questions. This conversation will continue on Thursday. Policymakers will join UNDP at the NextGen Asia Summit to discuss how governments can use anticipatory, experimental, and inclusive approaches to reform and recover from COVID-19. And so please do tune in to the UNDP Asia Pacific Regional Innovation Center for more updates on this week. Thank you so much. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you, Mitra. Thanks, Titon, for being the sparring partners. And thank you for 100 listeners who were with us. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Bye.